The Jetsons, Charlton, Issue 7. George has an exaggerated reaction to Astro chewing on his slipper, throwing it towards him. But Astro thinks like a human in this series, so he has no excuse for doing that to his slippers. As usual, Jane isn't on his side, standing in front of Astro, but to be fair, he is planning on animal abuse. She says Astro is a royal Syrian hound, so he's an alien. He's literally an alien in canon. So it's too bad this wasn't explained in the show to make it official, because now I know why he thinks like a human. It's too bad the episode he first appeared in didn't have anyone questioning why he could talk. Instead, Elroy just said, he talks like this because he's a puppy. Somehow, George says Astro's stupid, which is only the case in the first panel of the story. Why does Elroy have to tell him that his breed has superior intelligence at this point? I'm glad this was finally confirmed. We even see a dog like Astro bored on the throne. Not only is he sick of bills, but he's upset that the dogs under him are complaining about the higher cost of living. He's the king. Why can't he decrease it? Apparently Sirius is not only the name of the star, but also the planet, like in Futurama's comic. I don't know why he's talking about bills though when he's the king. He ends up driving to Earth for a vacation and plans to pretend he's an ordinary dog. But if even Elroy and Jane know Astro's true nature, when somehow George didn't, everyone would know he's not an ordinary dog on sight. Unless Sirius dogs are so rare that most people haven't heard of them and can't tell them apart from Great Danes. Astro goes out because his family thinks he needs the heir after George was mean to him. He gets replaced by King Sirius, who we'll call King. He rings the doorbell and sadly talks to George, and not like Scooby-Doo. So I have to remind myself that Jane said Astro is only descended from the Sirius Stones, which is why he can't talk just like a person. King threatens George for threatening him, which scares him into telling Jane, who plans to call a psychiatrist because he said he can talk. It's annoying that the whole conflict comes from the comic not being like the main canon for no reason. It's not like it advertises everything that makes it different on the covers or marketing. While with stuff like Archie Sonic, you know what you're getting into. And the story ends with Astro being back and George's family thinks he's crazy, but at least he's still at home. You'd think King would have not talked if he wanted to disguise himself so badly. It's confusing that the text says the Syrian dog star flew back to his own planet, when clearly that's not a star. Why would a species be called Syrian dog star? Elroy throws a ball for Astro and he follows it, and it takes too many panels for him to notice some creatures in a dark cave. It's either a bear or a bat. He goes back to Elroy and thinks about what happened to him. Elroy responds to him as if he read his mind, and his response to the glowing eyes in the cave proves that he did. Good thing the previous story exists so I can assume he's able to transmit his thoughts because he's descended from aliens. But he couldn't do that in that story. It's still better than him talking because it makes more sense. They return home and somehow Rosie thinks it's impossible to live in a cave. I guess it makes sense because she spends all of her time taking care of a house and almost never watches TV. So she wouldn't have found out things live in caves. She's already familiar with that cave, so maybe she knows there's nothing to eat in there. She jumps to the conclusion that alien invaders are in the cave and tries to warn George without him being in the room. She goes to the cave in this padded out story as to wonder if there will be a lame twist. Even though the artist had the eyes look mean the whole story, she thinks it's dark in there and doesn't turn on any night vision. Screams, and now Astro can talk with nobody questioning it. And conveniently, someone from the Space Patrol was driving by in the wilderness and hears this. When Elroy tells him what happened, he thankfully believes him to the point of saying this could be serious and plans to call in reinforcements. When even a kid says he doesn't know what they are yet. If the owners of the eyes is that dangerous, why did it wait until Rosie approached it to do something that makes someone scream? Wouldn't it have gone to attack Elroy for food instantly? I guess it wasn't hungry. So the guy calls someone on Skype with his car and his best equipment starts listening for signals from the cave. The guided missiles are ready and he's told to wait for his order to fire. He's planning to rescue the robot and then get out of there. and someone asks if he's sure they're aliens, making me wonder if they aren't again. The men get scared and aren't willing to go into the cave, and eventually an off-model version of George shows up saying that he'll show them and doesn't need protection. He has no reason to think that, unless he's going off the fact that Elroy didn't get hurt right away by it. But by not saying that, he looks really stupid. He goes in and an owl-faced bat flies out, and Rosie says she slipped and fell, so that's why she couldn't get out. I don't think it was natural for that guy to say slightly embarrassing, but it's great that they didn't get mad at Elroy and Rosie for being wrong and wasting their time. In the next story, George plans to take Astro and Elroy on a sightseeing trip to Mars like it's nothing, and even references that they've been there before. Elroy says their spaceship is falling apart, and it starts diving without falling apart. And eventually they bounce out of it from a rough landing. The terraformed Mars has soft ground to land on, and out of nowhere, it turns out George doesn't know what planet this is, when obviously it'd have to be Mars. It's not like there'd be a ton of planets right beside it. Considering that Elroy's friends with a Martian, George not going to Mars is a big wasted opportunity. This story is really padded out, but at least its padding panels have nothing to talk about, so it's still going fast in a review. George sees crying aliens who stop crying upon seeing how weird they look and laugh. Eventually, George gets shown appreciation for bringing happiness to them, and told that suddenly they couldn't smile anymore until he showed up, because their king sucks. One of them somehow thinks that if the king laughs, he'll become nice. No one questions this either, because bad writers make every single character just as stupid if the plot demands it. It takes too long to get to the point where the king ends up being in the same panel as Astro, where nothing new happens. Astro barks at the king and he falls over and miraculously laughs instead of being scared of a big dog not respecting his personal space. How did Astro get the idea that this was a good idea? Luckily, the king laughs for too many panels and says he wants to reward George for this. Somehow, George is dumb enough to turn down a reward. Then he at least says he'll be delighted to be his guest, and he and Elroy eat some food, without the writer bothering to explain what they're eating. Naturally, the king doesn't look forward to them leaving. It turns out he thinks they'll all go back to being miserable without them. He should get a different job so he'll be happy. And the rest of them will be happy if they have a better king. But George and Elroy would get in trouble for even suggesting it. Luckily, George thinks to tell him he can get him a remedy against boredom. A parent. A deus ex machina never hinted at being in the spaceship. Parents barely know how to say anything, so he'd run out of entertainment with them quick. He whispers in the king's ear, even though he wouldn't think to whisper, and the king reacts like he heard a good joke. Because it must be an alien sentient bird. That's why he has the self-awareness to talk about himself and say he belongs to the nobility of the planet now. Because apparently it has nobility, and not just the king. But still, most of the time the only things we learn about the other planets are things that could have been the case for Earth as well. Like, especially if Earth can have aliens living on it. It usually feels like Earth anyways. George warns him that he needs to bathe the parrot every day, and he starts flying away because of it. He just had to say that and ruin their happy ending. Lucky for him, he drives away successfully. I assume the spaceship got repaired by the natives as a reward. In the next story, George gets told what's for dinner and tells Jane to refreeze the hamburger because he thinks he can make a Martian casserole. Somehow, she doesn't tell him that nobody they know can cook and so he shouldn't bother. That they can't even use the Food-O-Matic right because they're so dependent on Rosie. George needs an ingredient only sold on Mars. He drives in the car and a traffic cop tells him to pull over because he went through a violet light, which is a $10 fine on Mars. His car blows a jet cylinder, and somehow he's gonna get charged for that, when obviously it isn't someone's fault if they have car trouble. This is a terrible running gag. At least he's told where to buy the Blipski from. He's told he can't get any because it's out of stock, and goes home to find out that Jane looked up what Blipski is, and it's hamburger, which somehow makes him fall over from the shock. I can't blame him for not realizing that Blipski could be an ingredient he already has that just goes by a Martian name, and looking it up just in case. He's lucky his family decided to do that. At least this means he does get to make it. So it's too bad we'll never see them eat the casserole because they knew it'd be better to have a funny ending. He went through all of that for nothing. Once again, it's a missed opportunity that George doesn't see some toy or his parents on Mars. I hope this means he won't be used again, or at least that George won't be frustrating about some again. But none of the Martians look like some, which just proves that none of the Martians are actually native to the planet, because it's impossible for a planet to have more than one variety of native sentient life, when it's a miracle Earth has one. So all of them must be descended from various different planet species. The Jetsons, Charlton, Issue 8. Naturally, George gets mad at Astro for biting his leg, which Astro has no excuse for doing. In the Charlton comic, Astro is definitely a lot meaner. And so is Rosie, who's usually my favorite character in the show. Alray has no reason to think Astro accidentally bit his leg and that he's clumsy out of nowhere. Jane's got no excuse for offering a dog that bit her husband a steak. He may have crossed the line stepping on his tail, but he was being bitten. So if it was happening for that long, I'm sure he already tried not doing that, and it didn't work for making him let go. No family worth living in would act like this. The story feels like something's missing by not explaining why Astro bit him. Jane gave her own husband's dinner to the dog, completely ignoring that he misbehaved first. I can only assume this is written because of comedic sociopathy, and it's completely unlike the show to have the family be this bad to him, like they're Spacely. George tries to have a sandwich, and Astro has no excuse for eating it on him. He needs to be sent to dog school at the very least. George gets licked, which Astro also has no excuse for doing since he'd know he doesn't appreciate it, especially since he has human intelligence, meaning he should know better than to do all of those things. Somehow, Jane still sympathizes with him over George, and expects him to take him for a walk. I think it would be ideal for her to do the stuff he does half the time, if they're equally capable of it. George makes it too obvious with his smirk and dialogue that he wants to get rid of Astro. I can assume Jane would have been able to convince him otherwise, but I don't know why she didn't insist on walking the dog. This is a bad story, because I'm not expected to side with George here, because the series is always siding with his family. It sides with what his family as a whole wants. Like it's going for old Chinese values of always caring about the family and collective people over the individual in every case. And while normally I agree that the needs of the many are more important, it makes for a horrible story here. It's obvious the person has every right to get rid of an animal that bites him, and that his family would be abusive for forcing him to deal with that on threat of getting whined at and bullied. Imagine if Jane had to be in his shoes instead. In any story he was being bullied by the family in, and you'd instantly see the abuse. So while he is being selfish by planning to give Astro to the first idiot who'd take him because his family would disapprove, what family wouldn't have this be the case in it for a dog like this? This kind of writing is just unfair to George. And I bet if the writer had a dog like that, he'd give it up too. Astro runs after a cat on a leash, and George runs into a tree. This never would have happened if he had taken him for a walk on the conveyor belt just outside the house, like always. But instead the story has him get punished with slapstick because of his plan getting him to go here. Naturally, he's thankful that because the leash somehow broke in the future and Astro took off, it's Astro's fault that he ran away, even though it's George's for taking him here instead of walking him just outside the house. And Jane would know that. Also, why does he think he won't find his way home from here? He can't be that far away from home, and dogs have a great sense of smell that can sometimes let them get home from really far away. Of course Astro's home by the time he gets home. I was looking forward to him going home without him to ruin his house. But instead, when he tries to go to bed, he gets threatened by the dog. Obviously this crosses the line for a pet to do. But somehow, Jane's so abusive that she yells at her own husband and said that he's been thoughtless waking everyone up. As if he had any control over the fact that he yelled when the dog bit him for no reason. Jane says Astro is so exhausted that she gave him her own husband's bed. she was nicer to him in the show. He's been home for hours before George, because George had to stay out late to make Jane think that he searched for the dog for a long time. How would Jane be able to tell that Astro is exhausted? That's no excuse anyways. Dog beds exist for a reason. Somehow, George is forced to sleep on a blanket on the floor next to a bone that's somehow in Astro's bowl instead of dog food. And I can't believe that's the end of the story. Why did the writer think that plot was a good idea? Does he hate dogs? Why doesn't he at least sleep on the couch? They won't know. I only say sleep on the couch because his family has so much power over him that if he slept in Elroy's bed, he'd say no to his own father, and he'd be bullied into sleeping on the floor anyways. I wonder if the writers of stories like this hate their marriage. It's not like Jane kisses or hugs him in every story, so she seems to give him nothing but abuse most of the time. And it's only easy to overlook because she's cheerful, though he could easily hug and kiss her every story. So it's half his fault he gets nothing out of this. But since she's always mean to him in this comic, I just want to meet a girl who treats him well and leave her for her. He's an idiot too, so they can both do better. So too bad divorce isn't free for them. It's too bad because in the 60s comics she seems like the ideal wife by comparison. In the next story, Jane says Judy's boyfriend is a great dancer. George overconfidently says that anyone can dance the way the kids do now. Jane says he'd fall on his face. I'm guessing I'll try to do it and fail. Surprisingly, he has enough of a brain to tell Judy in secret to give him dancing lessons without telling Jane, and bribe her with his stereo in exchange. After he doesn't do well, thankfully, only one panel later he starts improving at the lesson. Then she tells him he could be too tired to go out with her mom tonight. So I wonder if she'll be ranked. It's weird that she calls her mom mother when she's especially informal with how she addresses him, when you'd think she'd be his favorite because he's an idiot. Sadly, the story ends with him having a cane from back pain because of the lessons. And Judy laughs at him, and Jane jokes about how he can't dance with her. This is even worse than Judy being right, but at least it's realistic. And he still got taught how to dance well. It's just too bad that we'll never see him prove it to Jane like was built up to, because this was the last panel for a funny ending. In the next story, Judy fawns over an ugly rock star on TV. For the third time. I don't know why George took so long to tell Elroy he doesn't like a pinup of a woman besides Jane. Elroy writes a love letter credited to Judy, and sends it to the rock star, and Judy's wise enough to assume he doesn't actually mean her, all because the rock star was wise enough to not risk embarrassing her by revealing her full name to the world. Judy hears a song about her, and despite the lyrics not being specific enough, somehow this time she wonders if she's the Judy he's talking about. George advised her to make one of the rock star's favorite recipes since he mentioned it on TV. I don't know why Judy assumes that the girl he was addressing on TV must live on some faraway planet. Mooney smells the cake from his car quite a distance away from the house. The story takes too long to get to the point where he gets served the cake with nothing interesting happening in the meantime. Then out of nowhere, he has a picture of that woman from earlier and tells Judy that it hurts him to look at her instead. Elroy could have easily not sent him the photo. He must have done this to prank her out of natural annoyance with her boy craziness. She throws the plate of cake at him, and the story ends with them at least singing on TV that she's a beauty too. Then George puts salt in something cooking after giving Jane a present. He adds some more spices to it and offers it to her, and the comedy page ends with them at a restaurant. There's a pin-up where George doubts that Cyclops exists, which makes sense because you'd think they would have evolved at least 2 eyes, since most creatures have them for better survival. So it is hard to believe that any species would evolve just 1 eye. But there's one right behind him while he's hunting on another planet. In the next story, Rosie's got a crush on a robot plumber. Why do all the comics forget about her boyfriend in the show? Hopefully it's because the writers find him as annoying as I do. And somehow, George thinks she needs a tune-up because she's singing. George would know who she's in love with. The robot Oswald flirts with her. Rosie damages the air conditioner in a plan to force George to get him back. And only the family's over-exaggerated from the show dependency on her lets her get away with that. After he flirts with her again, she trails off and makes a noise. Oswald plans to push a reset button for her, and out of nowhere, George protectively stands in front of her and tells him to leave her alone, and does it for her. Oswald at least has the courtesy to ask George permission to take Rosie out for a date. Surprisingly, George says he'll have to discuss it with Mrs. Jetson. Why doesn't he just call her his wife? Why would he care that Rosie is too young to be dating when she's a robot with the mind of an adult? By that logic, every robot would have to wait 13 years to date. Somehow, Jane computered her so she'd know how to cope with Oswald. Rosie gets given flowers, and George tells Jane that Oswald might want Rosie to elope with him. Out of nowhere, Jane assumes Rosie would quit because she got married, even though Oswald would still be spending all day at other houses anyways. So she might as well live in the same house. Jane gets worried and thinks she'll be stuck cleaning even though she could always hire a new maid. That's mentioned in the episode where she hired Rosie. All she had to do to clean was press a button for each task. They stay up late pacing, and Oswald plans to give Rosie a goodnight kiss, just to get shocked, and ditch her because he's wired for a different vault number than her. Obviously they would have told each other their vault number ahead of time and never gone on the date. I don't know why robots have the same level of sentience would have other vault numbers with this result. It's silly, but it's much better than what was being built up to. Getting me mad at Jane for ruining a relationship. Instead, George's worrying her was pointless. In the next story, Sam gives Elroy an idea for how to use his chemistry set to make what looks like a diamond. Let me guess, it's only a temporary diamond, or not a real one. If it was this easy, diamonds wouldn't be valuable anymore. Unless people still have a separation between natural diamonds and chemically made diamonds, like in the modern day. I guess only Martians know how to do this, and Sam is very reckless. George tells Elroy to do it again, and he says he has to go to bed now. But since George is in charge of him, there's no reason he would let Elroy arbitrarily decide to go to bed now, so the plot wouldn't happen. I have to assume the reason Sam isn't helping George with this is pure apathy. You'd think George would have learned from the last time using a chemistry set went horribly wrong. George asks what 10Q is. Sam would hear him right behind him, and instead he runs off. You'd think he'd want Elroy to get rich so he could take advantage of that. George recklessly chooses just any random chemical and miraculously makes a whole pile of diamonds. Predictably, they all melt into water. I say water because since diamonds are usually solid, at the temperature required to melt them, liquid diamonds would horribly burn his hands. So they never were diamonds because they shapeshift into water after an hour. Elroy could have easily told him this right away and avoided the whole story. It doesn't come off like an hour passed. It came off like only a few minutes did. This is a depressing ending, but it would have been so easy for George that it'd make us jealous. And the diamonds had to be temporary to fill in the potential plot hole of them being still valuable. Then there's the more comedy pages. Because their master computer's down, they don't have any light, heat, or air conditioning. It'd be believable if Jane called it their generator instead. Why tie all of that to one machine that can break down? George plans to fix it, and Elroy just decides to phone the repairman. This is so insulting to George's character, because he fixes the Food-O-Matic in cars sometimes. So clearly if he's able to fix futuristic technology, it's out of character for him to be bad at fixing stuff like this. Thankfully, after he gives up, the repairman doesn't know what's wrong with it, and all that's wrong is that it wasn't plugged in. Why did it get unplugged? I have to assume Rosie accidentally unplugged it. But you'd think that after she tripped over the wires, she'd find out it got unplugged and plug it back in. The first story is about Astro getting impersonated by an alien ruler because he wants a vacation, which only leads to George being considered crazy because he says Astro can talk, because the alien talked for no reason. As boring as what actually happens in the plot is, I'm glad it's centered around an alien. So I was just impressed that the story finally confirms that Astro is special and explains why. The second story is about Elroy and Astro finding out there's a creature in the cave that's too dark to see, and telling Rosie, who assumes it's an alien invader even though it didn't talk to them. when normally she isn't the type to jump to panicky and unlikely conclusions as a logical robot. This didn't take advantage of the sci-fi future environment, and its style of foreshadowing gave away that it was harmless early, if it wasn't already obvious from the fact that the creature didn't attack Alroy right away. But it was always engaging because I wanted to see what exactly it was. Somehow, it only gets resolved when George goes up to Alroy out of nowhere when he had no reason to go there, and goes into the cave without protection for no reason. The third story is about George and Alroy heading for another planet for sightseeing, and because the spaceship malfunctions for no apparent reason, it decides not to land on Mars to visit some toy, instead giving us a very repetitive, padded out plot where the aliens all laugh at George and Elroy's looks. Thankfully, they take it in good stride instead of the writer being sadistic with it like a 2000s Sabrina writer. And they get taken to the king under the insane logic that them laughing would turn him good, only for him to not find them funny, but miraculously laugh at Astro instead of being terrified of him being too close to him, which he somehow thought he could get away with. So the king treats George well, and George ends up giving him a parrot for entertainment that he showed no hint of having earlier to quickly convince him to let them go home. They could have just as easily run away to the spaceship being chased and escaped more believably. The parrot isn't even providing a happy ending, because it flies away from them not wanting a bath. It was a story with some very convenient resolutions, but I can appreciate it for being a creative plot, even if it shouldn't have had so much comic space. Then there's a story where George goes to Mars for an ingredient for one of its recipes. That's a perfect excuse for Rick to go to other planets all the time, that it'd have exclusive recipes and ingredients, and while he could get ingredients with his portal gun, he'd have to actually go there to find recipes. Too bad we're never told that's why he does that, because it's a better excuse than the ones he comes up with. It's interesting that George gets fined for driving through a purple light, but it's needlessly annoying that he gets fined for car trouble. It didn't even have to be a part of the story. His trip was all for nothing. He finds out the ingredient was just one that he already had. So why would his recipe call a hamburger by a Martian name and not the rest of the ingredients? Since the Martian at the shop speaks English, I have to assume it's because they all speak it and Blipsky is just slang for a hamburger that they always use. The first story sucked from informed wrongness, because Astro bites George and eats his food for no reason, and yet the family somehow sides with Astro when he's being out of character, so George has every right to want to get rid of him. And I bet this would happen in every family that isn't abusive, so the writer is being insanely unfair to George. We're on his side here, so it's not a fun experience, as we're given no reason to sympathize with his family who he plans to turn on. So I'd rather side with the one smart person who's being wronged than a bunch of jerks. After Astro comes home before George because he's a dog, Jane somehow refuses to let George sleep in his bed without knowing that he wanted him gone, and makes him sleep on the floor, not even on the sofa, because she somehow knew Astro was exhausted and let the dog sleep in his bed. I get a divorce. This doesn't have anything to do with sci-fi either. The second story is George get the clever idea to get dance lessons from Judy in secret when Jane doubts he could dance as well as her boyfriend. He tells Jane he made reservations at the Venusian room where he'll show her he can dance better than Harold. This didn't use sci-fi technology, and while I mostly liked the story, it insisted on punishing George for being smart for once because his old age gave him back pain from the lessons. It only looks like it was all for nothing because we don't get to see him dance in front of Jane, but at least I know he would have done it eventually. Then Elroy writes a love letter credited to Judy to get a rock star to come to his house, and for no reason he included the photo of a woman that George wanted him to get rid of for no reason now and not earlier. Jane would have waited. And so the rock star asks for that woman instead and offends Judy, who must still be pretty because of all the boyfriends she gets, so that's silly. It's surprising that she never finds out Elroy was responsible for all of this. This has nothing to do with sci-fi either, and it was annoying that she liked a guy who looked like that, so I didn't like the story. After that is a story where Rosie falls for the plumber and eventually gets asked out by him. And it's only resolved when a kiss shocks him because they're wired for different volt levels. which they would have found out by discussing it before the date. The story could have also easily not happened because of how arbitrary it is that the plumber was a robot. It's annoying because after Rosie breaks the air conditioner on her boss, and as usual it's a karma Houdini, because this didn't directly punish her for it, Jane doesn't even care what she did and she gets a date with him. Then there's an interesting story where Elroy reveals that with Sam's formula he can create diamonds with just a chemistry set, because it's magic. And George recreates the formula because it was written down, lucking out to actually succeed in it. And predictably, they're temporary, even though this is a comic without continuity. So there's no excuse for them not getting rich at the end and wasting it all. Other than the fact that they had to be temporary to explain why diamonds are so valuable when any kid can make them. This whole story would have never happened, even if you assume that Sam used potion ingredients for his chemistry set to have the creation of them make sense. And that's because when Elroy says he has to go to bed, George would have told him to stay up and do what his father told him. And Elroy had no excuse for keeping it from George that the diamonds were temporary. He wasn't enjoying the family being mistaken about them. So it's not like he wanted George to be disappointed.